Sarah Miller stood at the back of courtroom 4B, her thin fingers clutching the frayed edge of her only sweater. At 16, she looked both younger and older than her age. Her face still round with youth, but her eyes carrying the heavy weight of someone who had seen too much. The wooden bench beneath her felt cold and unfamiliar, like everything else in her life these past 8 months. The courtroom was busy that Monday morning. Men in suits moved quickly past her, while office workers called for jury duty checked their phones impatiently. No one noticed the teenage girl with dirty blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her jeans worn thin at the knees, and a backpack that contained everything she owned in the world. Case number 47,293, Sarah Miller, trespassing on private property, the court clerk announced in a bored voice. Sarah walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. Her worn sneakers made no sound on the polished floor. The public defender beside her, Mr. Reynolds, had met her only 15 minutes earlier. He smelled of coffee and had dark circles under his eyes. He had quickly explained that she should plead guilty, accept community service, and move on. But move on to where? Sarah wondered. Miss Miller, you are charged with trespassing at the West Side Community Shelter after hours on February 12th. How do you plead? Judge Harrington asked without looking up from his papers. Sarah didn't answer right away. Something about the judge's voice seemed familiar. She studied his face, the gray hair, the glasses that sat low on his nose, the stern line of his mouth. Then suddenly she remembered. This was the same judge who had signed her family's eviction papers last summer. The same judge who had refused to give them more time when her father was in the hospital. The same judge whose decision had shattered her family like glass hitting concrete. The courtroom waited for her answer. Mr. Reynolds nudged her gently. Miss Miller. Judge Harrington finally looked up, irritation crossing his face. The court is waiting for your plea. Something broke inside Sarah. 8 months of hunger. 8 months of fear. 8 months of searching for her father in homeless camps and visiting her mother in the free clinic where she fought infection after infection. 8 months of sleeping in parks, under bridges, and finally, in the shelter's storage room where she was caught. You, Sarah said, her voice starting as a whisper but growing stronger with each word. You took my family. The judge blinked, confused. Excuse me? You too, okay, am I family? Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face now. Last July, in this same room, the Miller family. You gave us 3 days to leave our apartment. My dad was still recovering from his accident. My mom begged you for more time. You didn't even look at us. The courtroom fell completely silent. Someone gasped. The court reporter's fingers froze over her machine. My brother is with our aunt in another state. My dad disappeared when police cleared the tent city last month. My mom is sick because she couldn't keep her diabetes medicine cold anymore. Sarah's words stumbled out between sobs. And now you want to punish me for trying to sleep somewhere warm. Judge Harrington's face had lost all color. He stared at Sarah as if seeing a ghost. I was a junior in high school with a 3.8 GPA, Sarah continued, her voice breaking. I wanted to be a nurse. Now I just want my family back, but you took them. You took everything. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then from the back of the courtroom, someone began to clap slowly. Others joined in. The bailiff moved toward Sarah, unsure what to do, as Judge Harrington raised his hand. Clear the courtroom, he ordered, his voice unsteady. Everyone except Miss Miller and her counsel. We need to revisit this case. 6 months before Sarah's outburst in court, the Miller family sat together at their small kitchen table. The apartment wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom unit in an aging building on the east side of town, but it had been their home for 7 years. Robert Miller, Sarah's father, stared at the pile of bills spread across the table. His work gloves hung unused on a hook by the door, a painful reminder of the construction accident that had crushed 3 fingers on his right hand 3 months ago. Maybe my sister can help, Ellen Miller suggested quietly, placing a cup of tea in front of her husband. Her nursing assistant uniform hung neatly on the back of the chair, ready for her night shift at the local hospital. We've already borrowed twice from her, Robert said, rubbing his forehead. She's raising 4 kids on her own. We can't keep asking. 12-year-old Tommy, Sarah's younger brother, pretended to read his comic book in the corner, but his eyes kept darting to his parents. The children had learned to sense when money troubles were being discussed. Sarah sat doing homework, her pencil moving quickly across her math problems while she tried not to listen. My disability claim was denied again, Robert said softly, pushing a letter across the table. They say the injury isn't severe enough, that I could find other work. Ellen took the letter with trembling hands. But your doctor said you need another surgery. How are you supposed to work construction with 3 broken fingers? The rent was already 2 months behind. The electric company had sent a final notice. The refrigerator held just enough food for 2 more days. Robert's medical bills from the accident added up to more than $30,000. I'll pick up extra shifts, Ellen promised, though she was already working 60 hours a week. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of a woman pushed to her limits. 3 weeks later, the eviction notice came. Sarah found it taped to their door when she returned from school. The family had 7 days to pay the full amount or appear in court. On the day of the hearing, the Millers arrived early. Ellen had put on her best dress, a simple blue cotton outfit she saved for special occasions. Robert had trimmed his beard and wore the only button-up shirt he owned. Sarah and Tommy sat quietly beside their parents, both wearing their school clothes. Case number 23,581, Wilson Property Management versus Miller, the clerk called. The Millers approached the bench. Their landlord's attorney, a young man in an expensive suit, stood confidently on the other side. Your Honor, Ellen began, her voice shaking. We need more time. My husband was injured at work. His disability claim is being appealed. I'm picking up extra shifts. We've lived in that apartment for 7 years and never missed rent before this. Judge Harrington barely looked up from the papers. Sarah watched as he flipped through the eviction notice with practiced efficiency. The landlord's attorney spoke about the company's policies, the missed payments, the financial losses. Mr. Miller, Judge Harrington asked, do you currently have the means to pay the outstanding balance of $3,200? Robert stood straighter despite the pain in his hand. No, Your Honor, but if we could have 30 more days. The law is clear in these matters. Judge Harrington interrupted. He stamped a document and handed it to the clerk. Eviction approved. The defendants have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Ellen gasped. 3 days? But we have nowhere to go. Tommy began to cry quietly. Sarah felt like the floor was falling away beneath her. Next case, Judge Harrington called, already looking at a new file. As they left the courtroom, Sarah looked back at the judge. He was already handling another case, another family. She memorized his face without knowing why. It would be 6 months before she saw him again. The first night after the eviction, the Miller family slept in their old station wagon. Sarah curled up in the back seat with Tommy, their bodies pressed against each other for warmth. The car had become their only home. Most of their belongings were piled in garbage bags at a friend's garage. They had kept only what they could fit in the trunk. Some clothes, important documents, and a few precious photos. It's just temporary, Ellen told her children each morning, trying to sound hopeful as they washed up in gas station bathrooms. Dad has an interview today. But Robert's injured hand kept most employers from hiring him. The construction companies wanted workers with 2 good hands. The shops wanted younger men. The delivery services required lifting heavy boxes. Day after day, he returned to the car with slumped shoulders and empty pockets. 2 weeks later, the bank took their car. A tow truck arrived while they were eating dollar menu burgers at a fast food restaurant. They watched helplessly as their last shelter was hauled away. We need to split up, Ellen said that night as they huddled under a highway overpass. Tommy can stay with Aunt Carol. I can try the women's shelter. Robert, maybe the men's mission downtown has space. What about me? Sarah asked, her voice breaking. You're 16, honey. The youth shelter might take you, but they separate boys and girls. Tommy can't go there. Sarah shook her head firmly. I'm not leaving you. We stay together. But staying together proved impossible. The family shelters had waiting lists months long. The next 2 weeks became a blur of different sleeping spots. A church basement that opened on cold nights, the corner of a public park, the back room of a sympathetic teacher's garage for a few nights. Then came the rainy night when police cleared the homeless camp under the bridge. Robert had gone to find food. When Sarah and Ellen returned, police barricades blocked the area. Robert was nowhere to be found. We'll find him tomorrow, Ellen promised, but her voice lacked conviction. They never did. The shelters hadn't seen him. The hospitals had no record. Robert Miller had vanished into the invisible world of the homeless. Ellen's health began to fail next. Her diabetes, once controlled with medication, grew worse without regular insulin. The small bottles cost more than they could afford. She began rationing her doses, taking just enough to stay conscious. One morning, Sarah couldn't wake her mother. A kind stranger called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors shook their heads at Ellen's condition. Severe dehydration, infected sores on her feet, dangerously high blood sugar. She needs long-term care, a doctor told Sarah. "We don't have insurance anymore," Sarah replied, her voice small. "We'll find a program for her," a social worker promised, but her eyes showed doubt. Now truly alone, Sarah faced the streets by herself. She was just a teenager pretending to be strong. At night, she cried silently into her backpack. During the day, she kept moving, libraries until closing time, fast food restaurants until managers asked her to leave, bus stations until security noticed her. School became impossible. How could she do homework without a desk? How could she wear the same clothes day after day without classmates noticing? How could she focus on algebra when she was always hungry? Winter arrived with biting winds and freezing temperatures. The shelters filled quickly each night. Sometimes Sarah found a spot, sometimes not. She learned which buildings had unlocked heating vents to sleep beside. She discovered which stores wouldn't immediately chase her out on cold days. The West Side Community Shelter had a storage room with a broken lock. Sarah found it by accident one night while searching for a bathroom. It was warm, quiet, and had a stack of donated blankets. For 3 blessed nights, she slept there undisturbed. On the 4th night, a security guard found her. The police were called. And that's how Sarah Miller ended up standing before Judge Harrington, the man who had started her family's downward spiral. Judge Richard Harrington sat in his chambers, his hands shaking slightly as he loosened his tie. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "You took my family." 20 years on the bench, and nothing had ever shaken him like this. "Your Honor." His clerk, Melissa, stood at the door. "Are you all right?" "Pull the Miller eviction case from last summer," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to see it." While the courtroom was cleared, Judge Harrington stared at the file now open on his desk. Case number 23,581. The papers showed nothing unusual: standard eviction proceedings, landlord documentation, court orders. He had handled 5 similar cases that same day. To him, it had been routine. To the Miller family, it had been the end of their world. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "The social worker for the Miller girl is here," Melissa announced. Karen Diaz entered, carrying a thick folder. At 35, she had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering and had too few resources to help. "How long have you been working with Sarah Miller?" the judge asked. "I was assigned her case 2 months ago when her mother was hospitalized," Karen replied, taking a seat. "But the family has been in the system since their eviction." She opened her folder and laid out a timeline of the Miller family's descent. The judge leaned forward, reading with growing horror. July 15. Eviction ordered. Family reports no alternative housing. July 19. Applied for emergency family housing. Denied due to lack of funds in program. July 23. Family vehicle repossessed. August 3. Robert Miller treated at emergency room for infection in injured hand. No follow-up care due to lack of insurance. August 17. Tommy Miller sent to live with aunt in another state. September 8. Family separated by shelter system requirements. October 12. Robert Miller disappeared after police cleared homeless encampment. November 20. Ellen Miller hospitalized with diabetic ketoacidosis. Condition critical. "This is what happens when we treat housing as just another commodity," Karen said quietly. "The Millers aren't unique. I have 50 cases just like theirs." Judge Harrington removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "Why wasn't this family helped? There are programs." "Which are overwhelmed and underfunded," Karen interrupted. "The waiting list for family housing is 14 months. Shelters are at 150% capacity. Half my clients sleep on the streets despite qualifying for assistance on paper." The judge looked at a photo in the file, the Miller family from happier times. Robert stood proud in his construction uniform. Ellen smiled in nurse's scrubs. Tommy held a soccer trophy, and Sarah, younger and hopeful, wore a science fair ribbon. I sign eviction orders almost every day, Judge Harrington admitted. I never follow up on what happens after. Most people don't, Karen said. It's easier not to look. The bailiff knocked and entered. Courtroom is clear, Your Honor. The girl and her lawyer are waiting. Judge Harrington stood, straightening his robes. Ms. Diaz, where is Sarah staying tonight if I dismiss this case? Karen hesitated. That's the problem, Judge. She has nowhere. Foster placements for teens are scarce. The youth shelters are full. She's been living in a different place each night. And her mother? County hospital. She's stable but needs long-term care. No insurance. Her father? Still missing. Police have no leads. The judge walked to the window, looking out at the city he thought he knew. Somewhere out there, Robert Miller was lost in the streets. Ellen Miller lay in a hospital bed. Tommy Miller lived with relatives far away, and Sarah Miller stood in his courtroom, a girl whose life he had helped destroy with the casual stroke of a pen. The system failed this family, he said finally. And I am part of that system. Karen gathered her papers. What will you do now, Judge? Judge Harrington turned, his face set with a new determination. Something I should have done long ago. See the whole picture. The courtroom felt different when Judge Harrington returned. The usual buzz of activity had been replaced by a heavy silence. Sarah sat beside her public defender, her thin shoulders hunched forward. Her face, once softened by youth, now showed the hard edges of survival. Before we continue with this case, Judge Harrington began, his voice quieter than usual. I want to hear Miss Miller's full story. Not just about the trespassing charge, but everything that happened after the eviction. Sarah's public defender, Mr. Reynolds, looked surprised. Your Honor, this is highly unusual. So is recognizing a defendant from a previous case, the judge interrupted. Proceed, Mr. Reynolds. The lawyer adjusted his glasses nervously. Well, in that case, I'd like to present some evidence regarding my client's circumstances. He placed several documents on the table. School records showing Sarah's previous academic excellence, medical records from her mother's hospitalization, police reports from the homeless camp clearings where her father was last seen, and letters from social services documenting the family's attempts to find help. Sarah Miller was an honor student with college prospects, Mr. Reynolds explained. She has no previous criminal record. The trespassing occurred because she had nowhere else to go when temperatures dropped below freezing. Judge Harrington nodded slowly. Miss Miller, would you tell the court what happened after your family left your apartment? Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. In that moment, something passed between them, the recognition that both their lives had changed since that eviction hearing. We lived in our car for almost a month, she began, her voice steady despite her fear. Dad kept trying to find work, but no one would hire him with his hand injury. Mom picked up extra shifts at the hospital as a cleaner since she lost her nursing assistant job when we lost our address. She described sleeping in the cramped backseat with her brother, the humiliation of washing in public bathrooms, the hunger that became a constant companion. When they took our car, we had nowhere to go. The family shelters were full. They said we could go to separate shelters, men in one place, women and children in another. But Dad was afraid we'd never find each other again if we split up. A tear slid down Sarah's cheek, but she wiped it away quickly. He was right. The courtroom remained silent as Sarah continued her story. How they stayed together until the police sweep that separated them. How her mother's health declined without regular medication. How her brother was sent to stay with a distant aunt who couldn't take the whole family. I visited Mom in the hospital yesterday, Sarah said. She doesn't recognize me anymore. The doctors say her brain was damaged from high blood sugar. She just stares at the wall. Judge Harrington cleared his throat. And your father? I look for him every day. Sometimes I think I see him, but it's never him. Sarah's voice finally broke. I keep his picture with me, in case someone has seen him. She pulled a worn photograph from her pocket, Robert Miller in better days, smiling in front of their old apartment building. Judge Harrington felt something crack inside his chest. How many other families had he sent into similar circumstances with his quick decisions? How many lives had unraveled after leaving his courtroom? The court reporter wiped a tear from her eye. Even the bailiff looked away, his usual stern expression softened. "Your Honor," Mr. Reynolds said, standing again, "given these extraordinary circumstances, we ask that the charges be dismissed. Sarah needs help, not punishment." The judge nodded slowly. "The charges are dismissed." Then, removing his glasses, he added something no one in the courtroom had ever heard him say before. "And I owe you an apology, Miss Miller. The system failed your family, and I was part of that failure." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sarah's quiet sobbing, not from relief, but from the simple acknowledgement of her pain by the very person who had once ignored it. Diane Jenkins had only stopped by the courthouse to cover a routine corruption case for the local newspaper. After 15 years as a reporter, very little surprised her anymore. But when she heard a teenage girl shout, "You took my family," at Judge Harrington, she knew this was a story that mattered. She stayed through the dismissal of charges, scribbling notes furiously. When court adjourned, she approached Sarah as she left the building. "I'm Diane from the Daily Chronicle," she said gently. "Would you be willing to share your story with me?" Sarah hesitated, clutching her backpack. "Why would anyone care about us?" "Because what happened to your family is happening to hundreds of others in this city," Diane answered. "People need to know." That evening, Diane's article appeared on the newspaper's website. "Homeless teen confronts judge who evicted her family." By morning, the story had been shared thousands of times. Sarah woke on a bench in the park to find her face on the front page of the newspaper. Her phone, which she kept charged at the library just to search for her father, buzzed constantly with messages from former classmates and strangers alike. By noon, 3 local TV stations had picked up the story. Their cameras captured the stark reality: a bright young student reduced to homelessness by a system that offered no safety net. "I'm not special," Sarah told one reporter. "There are kids at every shelter with stories just like mine." Her words hit a nerve in the community. People who had walked past homeless individuals for years without a second glance suddenly saw them differently. These weren't just faceless strangers. They were families torn apart, workers injured on the job, children missing school. Pastor Mike from the downtown community church called an emergency meeting with local religious leaders. "We have empty classrooms sitting unused 6 days a week," he told them. "We can create temporary housing immediately." By nightfall, 3 churches had opened their doors to homeless families, with volunteers bringing mattresses, blankets, and hot meals. At City Hall, council members found their phones ringing nonstop. The mayor, initially reluctant to comment on a single unfortunate case, called an emergency session after receiving over 2,000 emails in one day. "This isn't about politics," Councilwoman Rees declared. "This is about human decency." Meanwhile, a lawyer named James Wilson read Diane's article over his morning coffee and felt a pull to act. His firm usually handled corporate cases, but he had started his career in public service. "I'd like to take on Robert Miller's case," he told his partners. "Pro bono, we need to find him and provide legal assistance." Across town, Dr. Patel at the county hospital decided to review Ellen Miller's case personally. "There's a special program for long-term care patients without insurance," she told her staff. "Let's get Mrs. Miller enrolled immediately." The most surprising response came from the Landlords Association. After seeing their industry portrayed as heartless in the media coverage, several property owners came forward with solutions. "We can set aside 5% of our units for emergency family housing," the association president announced. "We just need the city to guarantee the rent." Sarah watched all this unfold with a mixture of hope and disbelief. For months, she had felt invisible. Now strangers stopped her on the street to offer help. "We found your school records," the principal told her when she called. "You can re-enroll immediately. We'll arrange tutoring to help you catch up." A local business owner offered Sarah a part-time job with flexible hours. "You can work afternoons and still attend school," she said. "And we'll provide meals during your shifts." Even Judge Harrington joined the effort, though more quietly. He called a meeting with the county's other judges to review eviction procedures. "We need to consider the human cost of our decisions," he told his colleagues. "There are alternatives to putting families on the street." By the end of that extraordinary week, Sarah slept on a real bed for the first time in months. But each night, she kept her father's photo close by. The community had rallied around her family's story, but her family itself remained broken. Judge Richard Harrington sat alone in his living room, the television muted but showing yet another news segment about Sarah Miller and the growing homeless crisis. His wife had gone to bed hours ago, after trying unsuccessfully to draw him into conversation. For the third night in a row, sleep eluded him. On the coffee table lay a stack of case files, eviction orders he had signed over the past year. Each morning, he had arrived at court, handled dozens of cases with efficient detachment, and gone home believing he had simply upheld the law. Now, each signature felt like a weight on his conscience. The morning after Sarah's court appearance, he had walked to work instead of driving, taking a route through areas of the city he normally avoided. He saw the people sleeping in doorways differently now, not as problems to be managed, but as human beings with stories like the Millers. "What have I been doing all these years?" he whispered to his empty living room. His phone buzzed with a text from James Wilson, attorney now leading the search for Robert Miller. Possible sighting at Street Mary's Soup Kitchen. Checking tomorrow. Harrington put down his phone and picked up a legal pad where he had been drafting something all evening. The heading read, Emergency Housing Court Reform Proposal. For 3 days, he had been researching alternatives to immediate eviction, rental assistance programs, mediation requirements, mandatory cooling-off periods before families could be removed. The solutions existed, they simply weren't being used. At the courthouse the next morning, Judge Harrington called a meeting with the other judges. Many arrived skeptical, some openly hostile to any suggestion of changing established procedures. "We don't make the laws," Judge Peterson argued. "We enforce them. If people can't pay rent, that's unfortunate, but not our problem." Harrington, once the most rule-bound judge on the bench, surprised them all with his response. "The law gives us discretion for a reason," he said firmly. "We've been using that discretion to speed evictions rather than prevent them. That's a choice we've made, not the law." He distributed his proposal, pointing out that every suggestion was already permitted under existing statutes. "This isn't about changing laws, it's about changing our approach." Later that day, he did something unprecedented in his 20-year career. He called a press conference on the courthouse steps. Reporters gathered quickly, sensing something unusual from the normally private judge. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the microphones. "My name is Judge Richard Harrington," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Last week, a young woman named Sarah Miller stood in my courtroom and said words I will never forget. You took my family." He paused, swallowing hard. She was right. 8 months ago, I signed an eviction order without considering where the Miller family would go. I followed the letter of the law while ignoring its spirit, to provide justice and protection to all citizens, not just property owners. The cameras clicked furiously as he continued. "Today, I am announcing 2 initiatives. First, a review of all eviction procedures in our county courts, with immediate implementation of extended notice periods and mandatory mediation before any family with children can be evicted." Reporters scribbled notes as he explained the details. "Second, I am taking a 30-day leave of absence from the bench to work with local housing advocates and develop a more comprehensive approach to our housing crisis." A reporter shouted, "Is this because of the negative publicity from the Miller case?" Judge Harrington shook his head. "This is because meeting Sarah Miller forced me to see what I've been blind to for years. The law cannot truly be just when it creates more victims than it protects." As he stepped away from the microphones, his phone buzzed again. Another text from James Wilson. "Found him. Robert Miller is alive. County Hospital admitted him yesterday with pneumonia. He's been living under the North Bridge. Coming to see you now." For the first time in days, Judge Harrington felt a small measure of hope. Perhaps some damage could be undone after all. 3 months after Sarah's outburst in the courtroom, the steps of City Hall were crowded with people. News cameras lined the street. City officials stood in a neat row, wearing their best suits and practiced smiles. At the center of it all stood Sarah Miller, looking almost unrecognizable from the disheveled girl who had once shouted at a judge. Her hair was neatly trimmed, her clothes simple but clean. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, but the biggest change was in her posture. She stood straight now, her gaze steady and confident. Beside her stood Judge Richard Harrington, no longer in his judicial robes but dressed in a plain gray suit. Over the past months, an unlikely partnership had formed between them. The judge who had evicted her family and the teenager who had called them out had become the public faces of housing reform. Today marks a new beginning, Mayor Wilson announced, holding up a document for the cameras. The Miller Family Protection Act is now law in our city. No family with children can be evicted without a 30-day cooling-off period. Emergency housing funds are now available within 48 hours of application, and rental assistance is guaranteed for families facing temporary financial hardship. The crowd applauded as the mayor signed the document with a flourish. Reporters shouted questions, which Sarah answered with surprising poise. "This isn't just about my family anymore," she told them. "It's about making sure no other family has to go through what we did." Standing a few steps behind Sarah was a man still thin from months on the streets, but with clear eyes and a proud smile, Robert Miller. His rescue from the streets had been front-page news. Found suffering from pneumonia after months of homelessness, he had been admitted to the county hospital just days after Sarah's court appearance. "I never thought I'd see my family again," Robert told a reporter, his voice still raspy from illness. "I lost hope out there." Now he worked at a construction company owned by a man who had read about the Millers in the newspaper. The job was simple, designed to accommodate his injured hand, but it came with health insurance and dignity. A nurse wheeled Ellen Miller to the front of the crowd. Her health had improved with proper medical care, though the damage from months without insulin treatment was permanent. She would never return to nursing, but she had begun volunteering at the hospital, counseling other patients facing housing insecurity. Sarah stepped to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly but her voice clear and strong. 6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom feeling like the whole system had failed my family, she said. I was angry and desperate and scared. But something unexpected happened that day. People started to listen. She looked at Judge Harrington with a small smile. Sometimes justice doesn't look like we expect. Sometimes it takes a broken system to realize what needs fixing. My family was torn apart by that system, but now we're part of rebuilding it. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Sarah and Judge Harrington walked slowly down the City Hall steps. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Sarah told him. "I want to go back to school." The judge nodded. "College is still possible. Your grades were excellent before. Everything happened." "I'm thinking law school, actually," Sarah replied. "There aren't enough lawyers who understand what it's like to be homeless." Judge Harrington smiled. The legal profession could use more people with your perspective. They reached the bottom of the steps, where Robert and Ellen waited. The family that had once been torn apart by an eviction order was together again, changed, scarred, but reunited. "Will you come to dinner next week?" Ellen asked the judge. "Tommy's coming home from my sister's. The family will be complete again." Judge Harrington nodded, emotion tightening his throat. The system had failed this family once, but sometimes even broken systems could be rebuilt into something better, something that actually delivered the justice it had always promised.